What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you my review after 100% for Strayed Lights, an atmospheric action-adventure with a relatively short runtime, developed and published by Embers, which is, I believe, their debut game, actually. Though, to get my usual stuff out of the way real quick, I review games after 100% all the time, and while that does include the achievements, it also includes more than that. There's a video linked below that will explain everything to you and everything that I cover. My Steam profile is also public and linked below as well if you'd like to verify this for yourself. Though, in the case of Strayed Lights, it's important to know, probably right up front, that this is a very short game. 100% took me like 7 or 8 hours, which I was able to do before today when the game is launching because I was sent a review copy by a PR company working for the developer. So with all that said, let's actually dive in and talk about this thing. As I mentioned, it is a short action-adventure title with a big focus on the art style as well as large boss fights against almost shadowy creatures. Normally, I would save this for the end of the video, but with this being a shorter game, which makes for a shorter review, I'm going to lead a little bit with some of my negatives here. My big two takeaways from this, in terms of the negative side of things, is that the game is very short and it lacks a lot of accessibility options. Much of this game revolves around various colors, and in spite of that, there is nothing really in terms of colorblind modes or options to change that, so if color is an issue for you, this likely won't be a good game for you to play. With the other thing being that this game is launching at $25 US and whatever that looks like for your regional pricing, and I was able to do everything in about 7 or 8 hours. A single playthrough was more like 4. And for $25, that's going to be a hard sell for most people. But nonetheless, the game does have some things going for it, which we are going to get into. Starting first and foremost with the story, of course. As I'm sure you've seen on screen to some degree, we play through this game as a light seeking transcendence. We are a sort of energy being. There's nothing in this game that talks or anything. Much of the storytelling is done through imagery or environmental storytelling, if you will, such as the dilapidated ruins or unlocking various artifacts which give you glimpses of the past. So the story is very much so open for interpretation, which makes it honestly kind of hard to spoil, even if I wanted to. But the general gist is that you need to fight off this sort of shadowy corruption as your light grows and changes and eventually seeks transcendence. We do this through a variety of progression systems, which largely comes down to skills, ability, and energy gain. As we defeat enemies and bosses, we'll be gaining a variety of currencies, with normal enemies dropping a passive currency, which is to say that we spend it on passive abilities, which constitute the lower half of this chart, and these will increase things like our base health or give us opportunities to do more with our attacks, such as counterattacking. If we defeat bosses, however, you gain a different currency that allows you to either acquire or upgrade an active ability, which we'll talk a little bit more about in combat, but there's only 3 of them, so it's pretty basic. The last main progression system here is energy gain. As you explore and navigate the world, you can come across energy orbs, and gaining a certain amount of these will increase your passive energy gain, as combat is largely dictated by filling an energy meter, so having the ability to gain more from all sources makes combat easier. So you definitely want to track those down. That, however, does bring us to the world and gameplay section, and I would say the game is divided up into roughly 2 acts. Each one of them has a sort of central hub, which will let you see other stray lights, which you can interact with a little bit, while also having some things that hint about the past if you're willing to explore and look around. But from the central hub, there will be one of several paths. Each of these paths is relatively linear and ultimately leads to a boss fight where you try to track down a roguelite, so to speak, that the achievements for the game mention as being siblings, so in theory they're related to you somehow. As when you defeat these enemies, rather than them being killed or anything, it says they are soothed, as apparently they're being overcome with their own emotions, which is what leads to the state that they're in. And once they are appropriately soothed, they wind up back at the central hub where you can meet and interact with them some more before going on to take on the next boss fight or linear pathway. So much of the world and gameplay revolves around navigating this very artistic and atmospheric environment on your way to various boss fights, which are the sort of showpieces for the game. However, on the way, you will be doing a small bit of platforming and exploration, a little bit of jumping around, and while the paths to the bosses are mostly linear, there are tiny offshoots here and there that can see you exploring certain areas, usually for the purpose of finding the energy orbs. Though sometimes the CG sees you jumping around and moving a little bit, and I will say that my main criticism of this aspect of the game is that the platforming itself is a bit finicky. Sometimes your character doesn't want to grab onto a ledge, or the jump doesn't work quite right, or you get stuck on terrain, just tiny little things like that. And while it's not a game that lasts long enough for that to really be a big issue, it does happen often enough to be noticeable. Though while you're doing this, you can also learn pieces about what happened previously, why there are ruins everywhere, how these stray lights came to be, and while none of it is told directly and is certainly open to interpretation, the game does sort of drip feed you some of that mystery. But as it is a short game, it doesn't have that much to say in that regard, though it does feel like there is a world at play here, or at least there was at one time. That does, of course, though, bring us to the combat section, which is potentially the most interesting thing about this game. Combat focuses primarily on parrying everything, which will of course draw the inevitable comparisons to games like Sekiro, which are also big on the parrying, or more recently Wo Long, for instance, though here it's more about maintaining a rhythm than anything. Though I wouldn't exactly call this a rhythm game by any means, there is a sort of cadence and flow to enemy attacks that you'll be trying to match to some degree, because most of combat comes down to managing both colors and parrying at the right time while also using your abilities. Both you and the enemy can change colors, typically from red to blue, and you need to match the color of the enemy while parrying them. Doing that will be called a perfect parry and will drain energy from the enemy into you. So during various attack combos, enemies will be switching back and forth between colors, which you have to match. Sometimes the enemy will turn purple, which is an attack that is not something you can parry, and you will have to dodge out of the way instead, or at least attempt to. So much of combat comes down to trying to appropriately counter what the enemy is doing via these parries until your energy gauge is full, at which point you'll be able to deliver the final blow, so to speak, which in boss fights tends to be a cinematic sort of counterattack to what the enemy is doing. There is, however, a basic attack function, though it is sort of secondary to the parrying. However, with a little bit of skill, you can weave in basic attacks on top of the parries, in addition to dodging out of the way. And all of those things together makes a decently engaging combat system, if a little bit simple. Though we're not done yet, as I mentioned, we do have 3 active abilities. One allows you to parry an attack of any color, while also draining energy, outside of just blocking damage otherwise. The other allows you to do a big damaging attack, or the ability to stun enemies for a short duration to sort of catch your breath. Nothing really game-changing, but much of the combat comes down to being able to parry at the right time while also changing colors or potentially dodging out of the way, with some of the later boss fights really pushing that aspect to its limit. Though the consequence for failure isn't much of anything. If you die, you basically just restart the fight or the area you just were, with not much in the way of consequences for failure, as you'd probably expect for a game this short. That, though, does bring us to the Steam Deck section of the game, and unsurprisingly, this game runs pretty well here. We've got cloud saves as well as full controller support, which makes for a pretty solid experience on the Steam Deck. No technical issues or anything. The game even adjusts the settings for the Steam Deck, so I would be surprised if this game does not get a verified rating, because outside of some loss in graphical fidelity, it's a very solid experience, especially if you're on the go, and for a short game like this, that's probably for the best. That brings us to our positives, negatives, and then we will wrap this thing up though. On the positive side of things, the art direction as well as the world you are running around in seems very compelling, especially the art. Big fan of their use of color here. Regardless of its application in combat, I do think the world you're moving through is very pretty to look at, frankly, which is why the game has a photo mode for you to enjoy it a little more. The other positive here is that this is a short and sweet focused experience. It focuses on a couple of gameplay mechanics, and by the time you've mastered those, the game was like, alright, that was what I had to offer you. Which certainly isn't a bad way to go sometimes in a world full of games that are sometimes filled with unnecessary bloat. Now on the negative side of things, as I did mention earlier, the exploration and the platforming can be a little bit finicky in regards to your character and actually being able to move, such as sometimes you won't grab a ledge ledge, or things that look like they should be able to be something you can traverse are not actually, which isn't a big deal by any means, but a decent amount of problems there. With my other negative being that the dodge mechanic is very inconsistent. So when enemies flash purple and you go to dodge, you can still very much so get hit, as there doesn't really seem to be much in the way of iframes so much as your character being physically out of the way of the attack. And because of this, if you don't always clear that, you're going to get hit, which can kind of break up the flow of the rest of combat. So frankly, I think the dodge mechanic needs a little bit of work. All in all, that brings us to our conclusion. So Strayed Lights is a very atmospheric action adventure that runs very short. Again, a single playthrough, you're probably looking at like 4 hours. And while I enjoyed what I've played of Strayed Lights simply because of the art style, the fact that sometimes it's nice to just sit down and finish a game in a sitting basically, it does, in my opinion, have a problem with its price point. This game is launching for $25 US, and whatever that translates to in terms of regional pricing for you. And that is honestly a big ask for a very short game. I think the most I personally would feel comfortable paying for this is about $10, because while I don't have a problem with short artistic adventures, and in that sense this game is very good, the price of this game is going to be a non-starter for a lot of people, myself included, honestly, which is why I would say buy this on sale. Not that the game is bad, but that it simply isn't worth $25. And that is going to do it for today. There is my review of Strayed Lights. I certainly hope you enjoyed it. By all means, let me know down below what you think of the title, and don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz while you're at it. But more than anything, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.